Director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, and I focus broadly on issues related to South Asia, but space is a subject near and dear to my heart. So when I heard about this, I volunteered myself to come over here and talk about it because this is an ongoing project of mine, and I'm interested in sharing my thoughts and my perspectives on this subject. I think we originally framed this as the Asian space race, but for the subject of convenience, we'll take this as the Indo-China space race. And I think these are two big space powers in Asia, and to keep our discussion confined and restricted, we'll stick to this topic of interest. I'll let Jaganath do the harder part, which is China, that is difficult to follow, and I'll manage the relatively easier part, that is India, which is, in my understanding, is relatively easier. And although the data does not quite add up, we can at least square the circle when it comes to India than in China, in my opinion. But having that as a precursor, I'm going to be a bit descriptive in some of the data that I've collected over the last 3 years and frame the discussion and leave it to Jaganath to discuss the China stuff. The Indian space program can be broadly classified into 3 main areas, which is applications, sciences, and security. There has been a lot of work that has been done on applications and sciences, and that's been discussed over and over again, and there's been a ton of literature around that. I'm not going to go into that domain. Rather, I'm going to discuss the security part, which is fairly nascent and something that's evolving in India, and I'm going to present a picture to you about what my understanding of security, which I've been doing for the last couple of years. So this is a project, as I mentioned to you, this is a book project of mine, and this is an ongoing exercise. And this project, the methodology is primarily through elite interviews and open source literature, and also some literature that I've been able to get my hands on from the military in India. And I'm going to frame this discussion somewhat like this. The popular debate on space security in Washington has been the threats that the United States faces due to the growing number of actors acquiring capabilities to degrade or destroy US assets in space. A common characterization of this argument is that there is an arms race evolving between India and China, and this race will eventually lead to the weaponization of space. In contrast to the close cooperation practiced amongst European states, space cooperation and relations amongst Asian actors have become increasingly tense due to their uncoordinated and independent programs. This is a quote from Clay Moltz's book. Therefore, a school of thought among scholars are of the belief that should the current trend continue, the Asian space competition or space race can become increasingly a weaponized one, making any potential American operations riskier than ever. This argument can be framed something like this. India's investments in counter space capabilities will accelerate Chinese capabilities, thus posing a threat to any potential US operation. Based on the evidence that I've obtained so far through national security managers, I argue that India's investments and approach to the use for fulfilling national security objectives is rather restrained, and these concerns are overblown, at least in the short run, for the following reasons. First, India is a late entrant to the space security game, and India's capabilities in India's space security developments and fulfilling national security objectives are rather measured and exploratory. Second, apart from the occasional and isolated statements from a few high-ranking officials, there is little evidence to suggest that India is developing an operational anti-satellite weapon capability. Last but not the least, India's technological and progresses in advances in this technical capability lags far behind the Chinese in order to attract any meaningful provocation. A study of India's infrastructure to fulfill all these national security objectives will clearly tell you that Indian infrastructure cannot support whatever a meaningful provocation, to attract any meaningful provocation from the Chinese. To put this into context, I'll go a little bit into India's motivations on where this incentive in India comes from. The earliest writings in space security in India was in the 1980s, and it was from the Indian Air Force, where there was extremely sparse literature. To be precise, there was one officer who had written about this subject, but that was not taken seriously and did not receive any attention from either the armed forces or the civilian space establishment or the parliamentarians. The second happened was the Operations Desert Storm in 1991, when the U.S., also dubbed as the first space war, where the United States effectively utilized its space assets in cooperation. It made the Indian armed forces sit up and take notice of the value of space in the context of warfare. Subsequently, the Parliamentary Committee, Standing Committee on Defense, recommended the creation of an aerospace command within the Air Force. However, the Defense Ministry rejected it and did not take it seriously. What really prompted India's approach, or changed India's approach to this subject, was the Kargil War of 1999, which they fought with Pakistan. In terms of imaging, ISR capabilities, imaging, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, at the height of the war, India had to go and get images from the ICONOS satellites and from foreign satellite providers, because they had no assets monitoring the troop movement in their borders. In terms of navigational capabilities, their MiG aircrafts were not fitted with any of the navigation capabilities, and they had to, at the height of the war, they had to go to the market and purchase GPS systems and fit it to their aircraft to conduct their operations. This was a glaring hole that the armed forces recognized that they had to fulfill, and this served as a catalyst to India taking these things seriously. And finally, in February 2008, after all this happened, the Indian government formed the Integrated Space Cell within the Integrated Defense Staff, this is once again a step short of a full-fledged aerospace command. This cell was formed as the unit within the armed forces to coordinate all their space requirements for the use of national security objectives. So when this cell was formed, there were the first thing that they did was define their objectives very clearly, and the objectives was designed with they imagined three conceptual scenarios where they would. These are the theaters of operation where they would use space assets. The first imagines India in an asymmetric environment. This scenario envisions India's use of its military-specific ISR and GPS capabilities incrementally to balance those asymmetries to resolve any outstanding conflicts or disputes with its principal adversaries, namely China and Pakistan. So the theater of operation extends for India anywhere from the Persian Gulf to China. It aims at utilizing India's military-specific space capabilities with its available civilian assets in a force enhancement mode in order to fulfill its mission of resolving conflicts or standoffs. So this was the first scenario, imagined first scenario. The second scenario imagines conditions in which India will have to respond to China in case of some noticeable strides made by China in the integration of C4 ISR capabilities, that is command, control, communication, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The scenario also imagines conditions under which Beijing and Islamabad cooperate more closely. In this case, Indian policy planners imagine a deteriorating regional situation and aim to exploit India's space capabilities in conjunction with its network-centric capabilities in order in real time to address any threats. This response basically aims at halting any further degradation in the balance of power. The third scenario, which is an extremely unlikely scenario that most Indian policy planners tell you, is it imagines a situation where India would have to play a larger strategic role to accommodate its economic and political interests. This would mean that India would have to exploit space assets in order to project force in the entire Indian Ocean region. Ultimately, this implies that India will use its space assets in conjunction with its maritime defense capabilities to project force in the region. So this policy planners tell you that this is an extreme case, and this is something that they hope they would not have to encounter. In order to address these threats, the Indian national security managers to implement these scenarios, they obviously are looking at the technical capabilities. The technical capabilities, as you would imagine, would be anything, three main capabilities. That is the ISR capabilities, the position and navigation capabilities, and the communication capabilities. The ISR, any satellite is dual use when it comes to imagery. I can go much into details in the Q&A session, which is by far the most interesting session. But the position and navigation capabilities is something that I thought was striking. I was having a conversation with Alana this morning. One of the main reasons for the position and navigation capabilities that India uses today, the receiver segments that Indian armed forces use today, it suffers huge technical errors primarily because of India's geographical position. The difference between Himalayas and the Indian Ocean gives them huge errors in terms of any geomagnetic distance. And for correction, that's why they use the Gagan. And the next reason is India does not have a contract at a service provider level or at a state-to-state level for GPS when most of its delivery systems are configured to GPS. So there is an underlying fear in the armed forces that in the case of heightened tensions and conflicts, there may be a situation where they may have to encounter a degradation of signals. So that's one of the reasons why they're interested in developing their own position, navigation, and timing. And the third reason is also it is a huge commercial spin-off when you use your own GPS, especially in the Indian Ocean region for maritime applications. That's why you have GLONASS, which is the Russian operated system, having these agreements with India to provide navigation capabilities closely with your Indian partners. Obviously, I don't have to elaborate. The third aspect is the communication capabilities, which I do not have to elaborate. Communication plays a huge role, and India has a huge domestic civilian market for communication too. So you can imagine, and with its growing maritime assets, you will need certain specific assets to be the bandwidth requirement will be higher, so that's on the increase too. Whether there is a domestic infrastructure to meet all these is a question that even Indian policy planners struggle with, because there is only one agency, the Indian Space Research Organizations, that is capable of meeting the service needs of the civilian as well as the security needs. While the DRDO, which is the military research organization, has put its hand up and volunteered to provide some services, certainly the expertise rests within the civilian establishment, the Indian Space Research Organization. And they have only two launchers, that is the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, which launches low orbital satellites, mainly imagery satellites, and the recent success of the geosynchronous launch vehicle that is capable of ferrying payloads up to the communication orbits is relatively untested. So this is to be seen whether the Indian domestic industrial infrastructure can meet the demands of the armed forces too. Is there a role for private actors? Yes, there is. There are currently 128 companies that service Indian domestic industrial base, but by far the major stakes rest in the Indian civilian space assets. Naturally, when you have space assets, so you have currently 23 space assets, 23 satellites, and you need to defend them. The China threat obviously worries Indian minds. Indian policy planners worry about China, but that's not a single factor alone. The Chinese ASAT test of 2007 definitely provided a knee-jerk reaction in the Indian establishment. But by far, besides having isolated statements from high-ranking policymakers, India has not instituted a program nor put money into this to say that we will respond to China in kind. But that also means they've kept their options open because they have not ruled their options closed too. There are two reasons for it. One is when I asked them what the red lines are, the red lines for them could stretch on the technical side. It could be anywhere like an event that equates the Chinese ASAT tests in magnitude. So if there is an ASAT test, somebody blasts a satellite off, you can find Indian policy planners inclined to respond in kind. And on the civilian front, it would be anywhere if there is a charter of any arms control agreements that is likely to push India to the table. you might see some reaction in kind. So ultimately, it must be underscored that any Indian response to this move will be a response-based event than India going forward on its own. But across the spectrum, policy planners acknowledge that there is a fair amount of recognition about the debris problem and what, they do not want to go down the road what's on the nuclear front. So there is a wide realization amongst policymakers about this aspect of the problem. So, the bottom line for me here, when I look at the study, the Indian program, is India's efforts at fulfilling its national security objectives are fairly nascent, especially when compared to the Chinese, the United States, and Russia. As other modern militaries, Indian armed services too are increasingly becoming reliant on satellites for routine communication, surveillance, and navigational requirements. Understandably, they're also concerned about the threats to their space objects after demonstrated Chinese ASAT in 2007. But by far, I would argue that Indian response has been measured and exploratory, and technologically, and examining these factors, they have been, they lag significantly behind the Chinese. And curiously, some arms control advocates contradict themselves when they question the credibility of an untested Indian ASAT. On one hand, you have arms control advocates telling you that Indian ASAT might be a threat that you might have to face. But at the same time, when they look at DRDO, which is the Indian Defense Organization, which has a tendency to inflate its successes, they take that at face value. I don't think you can have it both ways. So you'll have to make up your mind where you stand when you're debating these agreements. So the bottom line for me here is there an arms race between India and China? There is definitely a race. India looks at China, factors into India's decision making, and yes, you're understandably you feel threatened, but it's not the kind of race that you expected somewhere it's not the race. The common conceptualization of the race we have is that of the Cold War, but you don't have a linear reaction from India, and you don't have it at the pace at which the US and USSR once had.
My notes. All right, so Bharath is left at a very good segue of is there a space arms race or not, and I think I will try and answer that question more on a comparative basis than just China. So about me, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center between the project on managing the atom and the international security program. I divide my time between nuclear issues and naval cases, but my credential for talking about space is that I wrote my dissertation on space security, but with a large focus on military space and trying to compare how China is militarizing space with respect to US policy. So that's what I did, and so I have active interest in the area. Alrighty, so that's my credential. I'm putting it out. All right, so let me first outline my presentation. What am I going to talk about today? So the idea of space race has two components as I see it when I started looking into it. There is the civilian space race, which is a kind of a soft power projection to diplomacy. So that's using your civilian space capabilities to obtain concession with other countries, getting them involved in you, forming conglomerates, stuff like that. So China, I will make the case that it's active in such a soft power projection in its abilities to leverage its civilian space capabilities for political goals. But that capability for China is sort of limited by its access to advanced technology to more developed countries. India, on the other hand, is able to have better access to advanced technologies, hence grow up the space capability ladder, but it has much more passive attitude towards soft power projection, or at least that's my opinion. We can debate this in the Q&A. So that would be my first part of my presentation. We will talk about the civilian space race as I think about it. And of course, correspondingly, then you have to talk about a military space race, more hard power projection, right? Weapons in space, satellites for active warfare. My take on that is that both India and China do have satellites with potential military applications, but that is nowhere as extensive as what the US does. It's extremely limited. It's more aspirational than its capability now. I will then make the case that Chinese military actions and plans are more motivated by US space and missile defense plans than as a response to India or as a counterforce to India's capabilities. That is one of the hypotheses I have. Similarly, I think India has as Bharath pointed out, very limited responses in terms of offensive space capabilities. Most of it recently driven by the Chinese anti-satellite test, where it's worried that because the Chinese have done it, we should also do it to avoid not being discriminated. So that's the broad structure. I will go into civilian space power and then military space power. All righty. So there has been a recent spate of Chinese and Indian exploration missions in the past decade. I mean, most of you in this room might know this. So the Chinese have done a bunch of human space exploration missions, lunar missions. The recent is the Small Space Lab experiment. They've been more active in space in the last decade than they have been in the previous years. India has done that too, and even in between these space missions, you can see both officials in both countries saying we are looking to China and India. Indians saying we are looking to China and trying to do this, trying to keep up. But anyway, so the Indians have not done a human space flight experiment, but they have done a re-entry capsule experiment. So there are intentions to do a human space flight. Whether the funds come through, whether it happens is anyone's guess. But India has done a lunar mission, but more interestingly, it's also done a Mars mission. The curious part about this Mars mission is the experts both in India and in America characterized that as a small victory for India in its civilian space race. The reason, again, I don't think it's as clear cut, but that's the characterization. The reason being that India has been able to do this mission before Japan and China did in Asia, and apparently that's considered big. I mean, again, it's anybody's game whether you want to take it such or not. The mission is still ongoing. It's not reached Mars. It's a long way out there. So, but again, so you see the semblance of a civilian space race out there. But in order to use their civilian space program for a soft power projection, both China and India also need to develop their in-house space capabilities. They have to match up to US, Europe, and then try to use those capabilities. But abilities of China and India to do that are very, very widely. China, for all practical purposes, its principal partner is Russia. Right? I mean, its manned space program is essentially Russian acquired, Russian trained. But the problem is that this partnership, it's not based on relations or technology development. It's based on a business model. Right? As my third point says, when the deputy head of Russia's Federal Space Agency was asked, well, we're giving all this technology to China. What happens if they get better and they start taking away the ISS, Soyuz business? And then he comes up and says, well, that's extremely unlikely. That won't happen. What comes out of that particular code is that the Russians are actively concerned about giving China only so much that they don't end up catching them. So the Chinese are constantly struggling with that. They have access to some technology, but not state of the art. And that kind of prohibits their ability to get really good technology that might enable them to engage in space diplomacy. And I'll come back to this point again. So this is not just Russia. China has, again, a similar troubled relationship with Europe. So this is, again, one big example. They have some cooperation with Europe. It's not all bad news, but major programs are problematic, right? So the big example is the Galileo navigation project. So this is the European attempt to do GPS, right? I mean, the Europeans say, well, Americans are doing it. They don't give us everything. We want our own thing, Galileo, right? So it was initially conceived as a private sector funded plan, majority private sector funded. And so the Chinese pledged around 300 million, full partner, very happy news happening out there. But then what happened was the Europeans were not able to raise enough funds from the private sector to run the project, and then the governments have to step in. Once the government stepped in, things started changing. They said, well, there's security requirements, we can't have China, sensitive information. And China at the same time started talking about its own system, the Baidu Compass navigation system. Again, their attempt at doing GPS. So again, the last point is when the Europeans were asked, by angry Chinese, right, give us some money back and give the interest to it, and then why did you throw us out? This was, I think, some EU space ambassador at Brussels who was saying, well, you know what, they originally said they wanted a smaller system, but they now want a bigger system. It's a competition. We don't want competition. This theme runs both in Russia and in Europe's interaction with China. The reason again why I try to bring up this difficulty of China to develop and use advanced Russian, European or US technology is that that capability influences its ability to work with smaller nations and build relations. India, on the other hand, at least in my opinion, has had a better success in able to acquire or work with much more US, European nations and get technology transfer to it. Part of this is explained by the recent rapprochement between US and India, the warming of relations. 2004 was a big deal when the next steps in strategic partnership agreement was signed. So that explicitly sets space and nuclear power areas of cooperation. And then I think in 2009 when President Obama went into India, they firmed it up and they removed a number of ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization's labs, from a sanctions list. These sanctions lists came out after India's nuclear bomb and they were placed on those lists because no more technology transfer can happen. Right? 2009, it's all gone. They can cooperate with very few limits. When the Indian moon mission Chandrayaan took place, there were 2 US experiments, there was German, UK, Sweden. Most of them were really major payloads. They were not simple, smaller payloads. This contrasts with China's lunar mission. It's all completely China with Russian help and some Russian instruments. The next Chandrayaan, the Chandrayaan 2 lunar mission that India is planning has a lot of French and US cooperation coming into play. It's yet to be done, but there's a lot of discussion. So the broad picture is that the Chinese have restrictive access to Europe and US technology. India doesn't as much. Now, so in spite of this limitation, as I've said, China still is actively able to use its civilian space program to exercise in soft power diplomacy, as I call it. And the best example that I came across was the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Right? But look at the list of countries. It's across the spectrum. It's not Asia Pacific in any way. It's Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, Mongolia, Pakistan, Peru, South America. I mean, Asia Pacific and Peru. Right? Thailand, Turkey. So there's this random conglomeration of countries coming together under China's leadership to form a group. Right? I mean, this is a clear indicator of a conglomerate that's formed to exercise a collective power. Right? So China formed this organization. It funds it substantially, training foreign scientists in Chinese institutions, and then it donated one of its small mission satellites to this group to collectively use in environmental monitoring. But when Thailand wanted to buy a satellite for its own remote sensing purposes, it didn't go to China. It didn't go to this particular group. It went to Europe. Right? And the reason they did that was they were saying, well, Chinese technology is not good enough. We have to now put our own money. So we want to go get a better deal. And that's the distinction I was trying to point out. These groups have worked to some extent, but because it's all China funded and collectively shared, countries, when they want much advanced stuff, they go outside this group. But that doesn't mean it's an ineffective group. China has been trying to form such groups and it has some success. The most noticeable element of that success is the last point, a mouthful, Asia Pacific ground-based optical space objects observation system. What's this? Right? So all these grouping of countries, so this is a future project, none of this is happening. But interesting here is that, as I said, soft power to hard power. If 50 years down the line, 20 years down the line, China is able to convince these countries to host observation stations at these locations, it's a huge shift in its space power projection capability. It can monitor satellites across the spectrum. Now all it has, it's from within its territory, right? So that's a substantial benefit that could come out from this grouping. I don't know whether it will happen, whether these countries will want to do it, whether China would be able to fund it. But what's interesting is that China has been actively doing this in order to form a group, and then it's been talking about forming these observation networks and putting them in place. So that's not the only evidence of Chinese soft power, i.e. its application of its civilian capabilities to political ends. This is one example. Another example is the number of launches that China has done for a variety of countries. So if you look into the basis for these launches, what you see is that although commercial, most of these were done in extremely favorable conditions to the countries that have these payloads. They were low interest loans, zero interest rate loans. In some cases, launch costs were completely waived off. So the popular argument is that both the satellites for Nigeria and Venezuela is more about oil than it's about satellite, right? I mean, at the same time when the huge oil deals were signed, these satellite deals were signed as a side agreement. So it's fair enough to characterize them as, again, another application of Chinese soft power vis-a-vis its space capabilities. You could disagree with that characterization, but there is enough evidence to make that characterization. And now, to quickly look at the Indian case, the evidence there is much more varied. I don't see an active I don't see an active effort to exercise soft power. So India has a much wider range of countries with which it engages. But what's interesting is this: there are two types of engagement it does. In some cases, those are university-to-university engagement. For example, Belgium, Germany. Those examples are very small satellites. So it's an Indian university working with a German university. So it's much more civilian collaboration happening. And then they decide to go to the space organization to launch it. So it's very passive space power projection. The second is the example of France, right? So that's a huge, the Megatropic, it's a huge environmental monitoring satellite. Again, equal cooperative development. India wants to get technology that will enable it to do its own. And then, there's French collaboration, sharing of data. But there is no heavy attempt to get diplomatic leverage from that work. So my opinion is that Chinese are very active in exercising their soft power vis-a-vis space capabilities. India not so. Whether that is good or bad, again, is open to discussion. We can take it up during our Q&A. Now, so we've talked about soft power, but when usually people talk about space race, it's the military space race, the hard space power projection that gets a lot of attention. Now, I have a rather contrarian view about this thing. So I don't think, well, again, I think Bharath would agree with me. I don't think China and India are in a very active space race. My opinion is that the Chinese are responding to the US plans, and India is in a limited way looking at certain Chinese capabilities, and it's getting worried and making noises. But there is no active India-China military space race or attempt to use satellites to significantly improve their battlefield capabilities. Well, that's a thesis, but let me give you some evidence. Right, so there is not much question that there's an apparent effort building military space infrastructure in China. They want to do it. They have a lot of satellites. The Yaogan series that I list there is both synthetic aperture radar, that is all-weather, all-night capability, electro-optical daytime capability. So they have satellites. They don't specifically declare them as military satellites, but they have those capabilities. But what's interesting is that there is very little effort to integrate those capabilities in a doctrine of space application like the US does, right? They have the systems, they could do it, but that process has not been completely managed. For example, the limited Baidu compass navigation system the Chinese have been putting up, like GPS, is highly civilian controlled. There is very little integration with their military systems, between those military systems and their navigation system. So they have the capability, but there's not much doctrinal movement in that. But surprisingly, so that would be your defensive space, your militarization of space capabilities. They haven't done much in that, but they have a demonstrated space capability in offensive capabilities. So the famous example is in 2007, the Chinese launched one of their missiles, an anti-satellite missile, and hit one of their own satellites, breaking up into multiple pieces. That's an anti-satellite weapon. They did that in 2007. Now, it is certainly a demonstration of Chinese capabilities, but what's interesting here, and this is where I think my contrarian views come into place. There's a lot of people who would think that the Chinese are very active in having an offensive space program, and I have certain disagreements, and I'll make the case. But interestingly enough, before this test happened, the Chinese have been constantly pointing to the US and saying, you need to stop using space technology to put space weapons in place. they have been saying to the US that your doctrines of control of space, ensuring space superiority, your missile defense, it's all a problem for us, right? And this particular, statements that I put out here is, I think, 2004, when the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister went at the United Nations Conference on Disarmament and said, in the last line, it's imperative we conclude a new international agreement to prevent the weaponization of space. So Chinese were saying this for a long time, right? America, you're starting to weaponize space, we need to talk to it or we'll do it. And then in 2007, the test happened. So there's a lot of debate about that incongruency. Why were they saying that, we need to have a treaty and then they go and do a test? Well, part of the explanation is that, like in any country, there are multiple masters. So the military might have done the test and the foreign policy establishment might be more open to peace. That's one possible explanation going around. So anyway, so the Chinese did this, and then there is some conflicting evidence on why they did this or what are they trying to do. But from the US perspective, that was a very worrisome event, right? Which is why I think they were responding to the US, and the US is now responding to China's ASAT capabilities. The US would say that we exploit space more than any other country. Our military uses it all the time, without which we wouldn't be able to do a lot. Given this advantage, the natural logical flow, they would argue, is that China would find it prudent to attack these satellites. And the famous term, the Donald Rumsfeld Commission on Space, or the Space Pearl Harbor, right? So what happened in Pearl Harbor? The Japanese attack, same thing will happen in space. Boom, one day 40, 50 satellites are gone, we'll be totally lost, right? As it says, without its eyes and ears in space to provide early warning and real-time intelligence, the US would be in a painfully awkward situation, and the case is Taiwan. Right? We want to do something in Taiwan, China takes out all our satellites, we can't do much. So that's the essential US argument of why China is building a huge military capability. Now, for the evidence of my contrarian view and why I think there is too much rhetoric about that and too little detail is, I'll give two small facts. US satellites operate across a spectrum of altitude. The lowest is imagery satellites, 1,000 kilometers. GPS 20,000, communication 36,000. But if you run the numbers and figure out how a Chinese ICBM can go a missile, their most powerful missile, it's probably 10,000. That's how high you can go. So the 2007 test was an intermediate range missile. So the most they can do is the current ICBM. You can run simple physics calculations, and what you see is that they can't go reach your GPS satellites, they can't reach your communication satellites, right? But then you keep talking about those things can be attacked. And so some of this is my dissertation, some of this in a forthcoming publication. I talk about those data and I say, well, if the Chinese really want to do this, then they should be building more powerful missiles and testing it, and then we should be able to see it. The second contrarian argument again that I make is that people usually say, well, the imagery satellites are really useful, we can't do much without them, we'd lose all data. And then I come up and say, well, there's a ton of alternate systems that are airborne, airplane mode operated that can do a lot more of this and much more better accuracy. For example, the J-Stars aircraft is one that was used extensively in the 91 Gulf War, and they were able to see the entire Iraqi movement flowing in. Well, that doesn't mean satellites are irrelevant, but what is interesting is that when people say the Chinese have a strong motive to do this, they completely neglect this point that there are alternate systems. The US wouldn't be so easily lost if its satellites are gone. At least that's my argument again. When I'm trying to make the case that the Chinese have, there is no clear established argument to make that the Chinese have a very active program for space denial. Okay, so that's China's case. As I have said, I think the Chinese are responding to US, and the US is in counter-responding to China in the military space case. It's not India, China per se. But that doesn't mean India is a trivial player in space. There has been a lot of interest. Bharath has done a wonderful job outlining the various goals that's been done. So my first huge bullet point list is all the various attempts, right? 2009, 2010, various satellites. So India's been building up its military space systems. But again, in India's case, I think I find a similarity with China. The integration is very limited. I don't see heavy evidence of India being able to use space satellites as much as the US does. I mean, they're thinking about it, but it's a process in play.
I'll just interrupt. Even the
Turn your
2001
mic on,
satellite.
please. Turn your mic on.
Oh, sorry. Even that one satellite, the one you see in 2001 that was launched in response to the Kargil war, was useful to the Americans during the war in Afghanistan than the Indians.
So, all right. So my modest efforts in India in using space for its military, but there are semblances where the Indians are responding to Chinese military, right? I mean, the Chinese are responding to U.S., but of course the Indians would respond to China, and of course Pakistan would respond to India, and then we have a chain. But anyway, so the Indian response is essentially driven by the 2007 test. Again, Bharath's paper would, I'm sure, have a lot of details in it. But this one particular code is that this Air Chief Marshal at that time coming out and saying, our satellites are vulnerable because our neighborhood possesses an ASAT weapon. Neighborhood is China. I mean, there's no reading between the lines. So they're worried about China being able to do this, and they won't have the capability to respond to China in kind if that comes to that. But it's just an idea. I don't see an active military space race, and I think the Indians are very cautious not to do that. To sum it up, space race, in civilian space, it's very active, and it might even have a good outcome. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to happen. In military, the space race is very minimal, if at all. I don't think it exists. Thank you.
I'm sorry, we had to agree on a number of points. But at least somebody validates my data and my reading.
Do you think that with the soft power Mars exploration and lunar exploration is influencing public opinion about and causing this idea that there is a space race? I mean, are they utilizing that? Because there's so much
You mean the
media.
Indians?
Well, both. I mean, there was that article that China had faked a launch mission to.
I mean, let me put this, on a more empirical basis, right? So one of my first job was working with the Indian Space Research Organization, right? And it was not let's leave the Mars mission alone. Any Indian launch, if you look at the amount of publicity that's given to any Indian launch and the amount of media attention that is given from the highest political levels, it's been endorsed. You either have a defense minister, not a defense minister. You either have the prime minister coming to some of the launches, or you have some high-level political figures coming to some of these launches, and you receive a wide endorsement. The scientific bureau has that cachet in the prime minister's office. For example, the Department of Space comes directly under the prime minister, and the media pumps it up, and there's a whole bunch of articles that's written about it, and the country goes into a frenzy when anything that has to do with the space establishment, or for example, even with the nuclear establishment. So yes, I mean, when they see the Chinese, they on public front, they would want to deny that there is no kind of, we're not competing against with the Chinese. We have our own agenda, we have our own goals. But look at some of the program characterizations. You want to put a man on the moon. You have, all these interplanetary explorations that are stemming out from what was the original goals of primarily the use of space for developmental goals. And why would, if that was one case, I would argue, why is commercialization of these activities not a priority when you have interplanetary exploration? Why, the Antrix, which is the commercial wing of the Indian Space Research Organization, considerably it receives lesser attention than its sciences and exploration missions.
Can I ask this, but as part of this, public opinion building or, identity building for India, the space race has got a much wider role into that. But how do you see this new kind of discussions being built around the ethical and, the moral value of the space? For example, sending a mission to Mars, the money that you spend on that, versus, the poverty in, the India. So how do you see this kind of discussion, coming into the policy making and affecting these?
Yeah, so actually both these questions. So when I was looking for this particular presentation about the lunar mission, the Chandrayaan one, the successful one, so there's this parliamentary exchange happening. The Prime Minister was posed the same question, right? By some parliamentarians saying, well, we have so much poverty and why do you want to put so much money into it? And then he gives this answer that, well, you can't solve one by one, you got to solve them simultaneously. That's official Indian reply to it. Personally, I don't disagree with that. I mean, there's a balancing to be done, but how do you strike the balances? It's at best very random. So here's the, when I personally think about it, here's how I think about it, right? So Indians have been doing things now, but what do we want to do 50 years, 10 years down the 50 years, 60 years down the line? What questions do we have to answer? And the way to look at that would be to what has Europe done, what has America done in the current years that has changed our understanding of science, right? We now know, I think in the past 10 years, that there are Earth-like planets that are around other solar systems. It's huge. We never thought we did, right? But then somebody thought about it, sent a satellite, built millions of dollars. Now you can say that knowledge is worth, squat. That's the opinion you have, but it's a very huge scientific development knowledge we have, and it propels our knowledge of our society much forward. And so I think we have to keep doing it. When poverty is an issue, there's a balancing act to be done, but I wouldn't color that argument that way at all. I mean, if you try to balance it, then you really can't do anything. I mean, do we build bridges or do we build food sources? Where do you draw the line?
I mean, I'll just amplify this in different ways, If you ask the Indians, they'll argue that, look, we've used space successfully for applications, right? So communication and remote sensing, India is by far a leader in remote sensing technology. You have a unique geography, you have unique coastlines, and you have to monitor these coastlines for various issues. For example, tsunami warning, this and that. And telecommunication, you have 1 billion people. How do you network all these people, One of the successful projects in space was in the early 1980s. TV was found, television was a way to curb population. Introduce TVs so that people have distraction and you could curb population. And why was that possible? Because of this experiment called SITE, an Apple experiment that they did with France. That was a satellite experiment, and the satellite integrated testing equipment, that was a project that they did, successfully introduced into the Indian system. So this is the way that the policymakers will argue that, they've been out of that. It is by far one of the most successful programs that has been myopic, carefully concentrated its goals, again, with matching its civilian needs and applying it for developmental purposes. But that said, very recently, the newer management in ISRO there's been a lot of disagreements with the way that they've gone about executing some of their decisions. At the higher management and the mid-level management have a lot of misalignment with their objectives, with what they see and foresee the kind of near short-term objectives that they need to accomplish. So I'm sure some of these questions that you ask, and I'll tell you, most of these questions are basically related to the security apparatus. So some of them want to be increasing the security focus, while the ISRO finds a way to shield itself in pursuing sciences program than security program, so that they don't. ISRO is a civilian application organization, and they do not want to be drawn into the security game. So they find this as a better way to circumvent that problem.
So perhaps wait for the mic, please. So a perhaps naive question. I've been seeing a lot in the media the coverage of the U-2 rover on the moon and the ways in which it's sort of become a social media phenomenon in China and seemingly also to some extent in the United States. Do you see, is this simply some scientists deciding it would be cute to play around with social media, or is there any sort of strategic logic in terms of buttressing China's soft power, demonstrating, here China's presence in space can actually serve these sort of universal human interests in exploration, that kind of thing?
That's Jade Rabbit, right?
Yes, right.
Okay. So any answer is a matter of opinion. I'll try to throw mine in. So part of it must be also for the domestic audiences, right? So like India, I mean, I'm sure Chinese would have to, not so openly, but within the society they must be debating about poverty and who's going to fund, and I guess throwing it on YouTube and then, saying, well, we have done this, we're the first, the latest Asian country to do it, it builds up prestige, changes perception. That's probably one explanation. Soft power, I think so, certainly so. So China is very interesting again, right? For a long time after independence till the 70s and 80s, China was a very closed-off society. Well, not closed-off, but the diplomatic engagement was very limited. They never did UN peacekeeping troops, right? They said we will never intervene in any country, we will not go funding countries. The 1990s, boom, things changed, right? They started contributing troops to peacekeeping, they started going to countries, Africa big time, and signing agreements. So they are very actively trying to grow their soft power, and this really fits into it. I mean, if they want to go and sell to Brazil that, look, come use our services to launch your satellites, they would have to demonstrate the capability to do it, and this certainly feeds into it. By the way, Chinese have been really trying to grow that up. I'm sure Alana would talk about it to some extent. The ITAR regulation, it's the International Traffic in Arms regulation, right? So the Chinese essentially can't launch any US payload or any payload that the Europeans have that has US technology. And so, but they are very cheap, so everybody wants to go use them, but they can't do it. And so they are losing a lot of revenue. So the only way they can go into other countries like maybe Singapore, maybe Brazil, is to keep doing these things, and the YouTube is a great way to show that they have to do it.
I would just. There was an interesting article by, I think, Jeff Faust of the Space Review about the Chinese and American coverage, or international, but primarily American coverage of Jade Rabbit and U2. And I mean, what's really interesting is that there was this period where there appeared to be maybe a technical malfunction with U2. It may or may not be dead. Sort of survived the lunar night, but not entirely. And the people who were the quickest to pronounce U2 dead were like the Chinese netizens who were on Weibo, and so that some of the most like social media savvy and let's say internet active people in China are also like sometimes the most pessimistic about their country's technological achievements, and they just concluded that it was a failure before it was even clear that it was, and then that turns out got picked up in the United States. But I guess what that suggests is that you can't really see this social media phenomenon around U2 as totally engineered from the top, because there's like a certain amount of sort of cynicism about it in the first place. I think a lot of the popular enthusiasm in China over the space program, especially something like the really high-profile exploration missions, is very kind of sincere and genuine. I think people really are super excited about the space program. I mean, there was a time where I think maybe there was a place for a debate about whether that was an appropriate use of scarce resources, but today China is building a lot of high-tech infrastructure. It's pouring money into all kinds of different like scientific and technological programs. So I don't think today people think that it's out of place or unusual for their government to be allocating resources like that. And I think it's sort of really is popular with the regular folk.
I mean, let me put it this way too. In this country too, we have tons of people without health care, right? And still, we do spend heavily on space. I mean, so when you translate this argument, you go to Delhi or Beijing and play this argument. This is what you'll get back. You don't, and furthermore, Indians or Chinese will argue that even if you think this is a mistake, we have the right to make our own mistakes. Who are you to come and tell us what kind of mistakes we should and we shouldn't right? Even if that means an ASAT test, if this means whatever test it means, Indians will tell you that this is, this is our right, and this is nothing illegal. It's an experiment that could go wrong, and failure is an option in any experiment.
Well, my question is about the response of the political and economic class and the population who sees what's going on and doesn't understand. So what is the reaction of the general population to these programs? And how the media in India differs from the media in the US in terms of public attention?
Leave alone the political and the economic class, for example, all right? I mean, let me even start with some of the military community. The military community that deals with these space assets. For example, that integrated space cell that you see is staffed with 5 people. Of a country of that size of an army, that integrated space cell has 5 people. I'll give you anecdotal evidence here. And there was this day where there was a naval commodore. The present chief of that integrated space cell is a naval commodore. And he was transferring his command from a brigadier. And I walked into his office. The brigadier was somebody that I've worked with closely. And the brigadier introduced me to the commodore. And the commodore, I gave him my card. I introduced myself to him. And I said, look, I deal with this subject. I'd like to learn more what you do. And his response was, oh yeah, right, I'm in space security, I've just been transferred here. Can you point out a single website where I can get to speed on space security in a week's time? Okay, this is the general level of knowledge with an average military officer. As a general, as a brigadier level, you expect him to know much more into what he's working with. So the business community is totally different. For example, the Indian telecommunications companies will see it. It's still a very niche market. This is very still niche market. The Reliance are there are I can't remember the name of the company that deals with images. So the companies that deal with telecommunications have some sort of a knowledge that the way that they react. Yes, that they know that they have to participate in these kinds of activities. Like for example, Tata has been trying to get into the market of defense, so that they know there is a huge potential out there, and somebody needs to do the job. There is money for taking, and nobody has the expertise to do it besides ISRO. And ISRO does not know how to delegate. There are 128 companies that are participating in the domestic industrial base, but these are guys who are just supplying nuts, bolts, and screws. But making a satellite is a big deal. So they would like to participate, but the government the civilian agency has carefully kept this expertise within themselves. And there are also foreign entrepreneurs who would want to participate in this market. It's almost a $1 billion a year market in space alone. And the foreign investors know it. What prohibits, that's a bigger question of Indo-US relation. It gets into the question of offsets and all this nonsense that we have to deal with when you're an American businessman going to India. So this is the way the business community wants to get in, but the reaction, the approach has been successfully thwarted by the civilian agencies themselves. The political community knows much lesser than what the business community knows. And the same anecdotal evidence for the political communities. We work closely with a member of parliament who is on the Standing Committee of Defense, and we supply him some of these questions. The problem is these questions are sent back to the military space cell, it's circular. So we work with both of them, and one day I was just shocked. I was just pleased when I saw the questionnaire being introduced in the parliament. There's been 2 questionnaires being introduced in the parliament, and the colonel who works in the military, in the space cell, he said, oh, we are the ones who are answering. I found it on his table, and I said, what are you doing with this? I was very pleased that I went to this guy and introduced this. And he said, oh, we are the ones who are answering this. And I said, okay, doesn't serve any purpose. And the media question between the U.S. and stuff, I think in media,
Equally annoying.
yeah, I mean, they like to blow trumpet at as high and wide as possible. It's all praise about ISRO. Seldom you'll find a criticism about this agency in the Indian media. There may be analysts who might say the bread versus bomb question, but I know, the popular journalists who write about this subject, I've never found them say anything contrary to this organization.
But as I understand from your talk, most of these, things are controlled by the military. So, do you not think that the military policy of secrecy affects,
They're not controlled by the military. They're controlled by the civilians with the military participation in those projects.
And that's India, right?
Yeah, that's India. Yeah, the India one. Because you talk about these, journals being transferred. So just to clarify, my own, because the militaries, do not usually give information to civilians.
No, on the contrary, I've found the militaries to be more transparent than the civilians.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, on the contrary, military officers are much more easier to deal with.
Okay.
On the contrary, yeah, and they're much more transparent than the civilians. The civilians will just, make you go in circles and give you nothing. The militaries by far. They've also been increasingly marginalized in any decision making. So there is a frustration that's creeping amongst the military officers.
I guess I would ask you maybe to elaborate a little bit on the idea that China doesn't really pose a major threat to U.S. space assets. I mean, I know you said that essentially only satellites in LEO are within reach of Chinese missiles. That still seems like a really big deal to me. Is that in fact really true? I mean, there might be other ways that China could destroy GEO or MEOSATs. And in any case, do you want to just maybe say a little bit more about why you disagree with the conventional wisdom?
Right. As I said, it's opinion, it's a contrary opinion. I wrote my dissertation on this with Nancy Gallagher and UMD. So let's break it up into pieces, right? So you can't shoot So again, the distinction is between ASAT's kinetic kill destruction and say jamming or laser blinding. Jamming, they will do it, right? I mean, in any warfare, the Chinese are going to react. So it's a very standard procedure to jam GPS signals. That's very passive. I don't say that's not going to happen. But to go and completely knock out a GPS satellite, they can't do it. And so the ICMs can't do it. It's physics. Again, I can send you my draft paper that's being sending out for publication now with German. One thing
Just a little two-finger line. I mean, sure, but I guess like what, people in the Department of Defense in the United States who have to think about like worst-case scenarios and who have to imagine, the full range of possibilities will tell you that, Chinese could theoretically detonate a nuclear weapon in GEO or spread a field of nuclear material throughout MEO and to take out GPS satellites. So they don't just look at that one system, right?
Well, so the nuclear question is it's not a concern because that would be really extreme for China to do it. Yes, they can do it. Then what happens next? Right? I mean, what would the US do it? So it's a huge escalation exploding a nuclear bomb in space.
Yeah.
So the funny part is it will knock down Chinese satellites too.
Yeah. And I guess to come back at you, the U.S. defense planner would say, well, China will be far less affected by a degradation of its space assets in wartime than the U.S. military would. So there is this, asymmetric advantage.
No, that is an extreme possibility that does exist, but the consequences of the possibilities are far worse to China than the United States.
How so? In a practical, tactical warfare kind of sense, or in a long-term, like,
Right.
economic?
So let's assume the
Political.
scenario you're putting out, right? The nuclear weapons gone, US GPS is all gone, right? That's the scenario. So what did China gain? Right, the US ships, so Taiwan Strait scenario. So let me give you some context here again. So what I did when I did my calculation was I didn't say a nuclear weapon. I said, well, let's assume China can do it, right? China can launch a missile, take out GPS satellite, and then you see how many satellites do they have to take out. So there are 24 satellites, right? 6 constellations, 4 in each with spares. So that's 31, 32 satellites constantly going out. And so if you really do the calculation, see how many satellites you have to take out to meaningfully degrade something, it's minimum of 6. You got to at one time take out 6, and if you do take out 6, you have a loss of GPS for only 90 minutes. Right? So then you go back and I looked at what's the value of doing it? What happens when the US doesn't have 90 minutes of GPS satellites? So the US has been very luxuriously fighting. It's got to probably end up having a slog match. So the Navy ships, the airplanes, they have very strong inertial navigation system, so they can operate. What would really get undone is the GPS guided bombs, right? You can't do JDAMs. But again, if you go drilling into the details where the devil lies, it's very interesting. So the GPS guided bombs are not the most precise bombs. They are officially classified as near precision, not precision. Precision is laser guided bombs, right? So you point laser and you go to it. So, and then you look at the percentage of GPS bombs versus the percentage of laser guided bombs starting with 1991 Gulf War to the Afghan thing. GPS is kind of going down and laser is coming up, especially the opening gambit of any warfare. So what people would usually say is the space Pearl Harbor, right? We will be pushed back 30 years, but when you go through this chain of evidence, none of that becomes so apparent. You can counter-argue that, well, something will go wrong, it will become very difficult. Yes, it will, but that doesn't mean the Chinese will win the Taiwan Straits conflict. They still won. I mean, there's no conclusive evidence to say that the Chinese can do it and therefore win the Taiwan Straits conflict. That's what they want to do, right? They want to make an action in Taiwan, take out GPS satellites, and they can get the goal done. Well, that linear chain doesn't hold up to critical evaluation, at least not in my view.
Right. I mean,
Can you speak into the mic, please?
well, I mean, I think all of these things are extremely unlikely, and like a U.S.-China war is extremely unlikely. So we're to begin with talking about, extremely unlikely events. But if one really wants to push back, like what's at stake isn't like the future of the U.S. military writ large, or whether this is going to like take out the United States. Are Chinese counter space capabilities advanced enough to prevent the U.S. from meeting its political objectives in a potential conflict with China? I mean, obviously, China's not going to cripple the entire U.S. military with a few missiles, but what I think people do worry about is that it might make it difficult and costly enough for the U.S. to succeed in, say, defending Taiwan, or even in now,
I mean, that's the frame that I opened with. Are China's capabilities advanced enough? I think there's no evidence to suggest that China's capabilities are not advanced enough. China's capabilities today are advanced enough to make any potential U.S. operation riskier than ever.
Yeah, more risky, more costly, more difficult, longer, and therefore, I guess that's really what people worry about. And when they get alarmed about all these Chinese capabilities, they could probably imagine a million ways in which you're right, but they care about the one way in which you might be wrong.
I mean, what you're increasingly seeing is we've collected some data on jamming incidents. What do you agree? It's fooling, right? That makes it costly for anybody. And if you go to the International Telecommunication Union, you will find the number of jamming incidents every year increase. The data suggests primarily, yes, there are people, this is primarily, the data that I've been able to access was primarily in Libya and in Iran. These data, over the years, you have had a number of guys who come up, and I'm sure they're state-sponsored, but I don't possess any conclusive evidence to suggest that they're state-sponsored. But it comes from latitude so and so, latitude and longitude so and so. And the number of incidents in the last 4 or 5 years are just growing. I think I've listed some of those data in that paper. And I'm sure, that there is no reason for me to not believe that China will not be investing in those capabilities. The Indians are investing too. Indians are not only investing in, they do not have a hard kill program, instituted a hard kill program. They do not have special money or budgets, but it does not, there's no reason for me to not believe that the Indians are not thinking about this. They see what's going on around, you see what's going around you. And like one policy planner put it to me in a very subtle way. He said, only by developing some of your own capabilities, you will really know what the adversary actually has. And that applies for India, that applies for China. To estimate what the Americans really have, only if the Chinese start doing their hard homework, they will know what the Americans have. They will know what kind of scenarios to prepare for and what kind of technologies that they got to match up to. So the bottom line answer to your question is, China is investing in those capabilities. There is a progression. They are learning. Any state learns, any human learns, and that is true to it. That is extended to a state too. And that will make what U.S. operations could have been cheaper 5 years ago is not the case anymore.
Would you say that the cyber war is going on in a kind of low intensity?
Cyber war?
Yes.
No, I didn't say a cyber war. I'm saying a jamming incident.
No, but could you extrapolate to the cyber war?
I haven't tracked those,
No.
but there's always, right? The Ministry of Defense, one of the days the Indian Ministry of Defense put out some of these white papers. They told me the next day that they were hacked by the Pakistanis and the Chinese, right? And they said there was some of these documents that contained language that was so, what can I call it? The language is so obnoxious. And you take it back and you ask them, oh, what's wrong with this? They said, no, we put it, the Chinese and the Pakistanis hacked it. And then I said, why don't you issue a press release that the Chinese and the Pakistanis hacked it? Which make them look like better fools, whether having your website compromised or the document that is faulty to begin with. But the Indian establishment consistently, even the Prime Minister's office has been hacked. There are many politicians who have suffered these hacks, and they blame it on the Pakistanis and Chinese, whether that could be internal, it could be external. Nobody really knows where the source, the attribution is the problem. The problem with acknowledging some of these attacks is the reasons that I mentioned, which makes you look worse, right? Thank you.